Hello. I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes now about particular types of character called protagonists and antagonists. We can use these terms to more easily talk about a story's plot and theme. We can talk about how a story relates to its characters and how the characters relate to each other. And knowing these relations, especially how a story relates to its characters, can help us think more deeply and accurately about what a story means. And we can learn more about these terms by looking at the parts of the words. Agonist comes from ancient Greek roots, meaning someone who fights. Every story involves some kind of conflict or struggle. So, every story needs someone to compete in that conflict or that struggle. Every story needs someone who fights, at least one agonist. We can distinguish these agonists from each other by considering their purpose. Because pro means for, and anti means against, we can say that the protagonist fights for the story's values, and the antagonist fights against those values. Thus, writers usually want to make us feel for the protagonist and against the antagonist. Thus, we can see the story's values by figuring out who the protagonist and who the antagonist are. Knowing how a story wants us to feel about its characters can help us understand what the story wants to say about the world. And we can see an example of this at work in Everyday Use, the story by Alice Walker. The story's plot comes from a struggle, a fight, between characters over a quilt that represents their family's heritage. Based on the favorable way in which the story presents her, and based on the way that the narrator who presents her seems to represent the story's values, we can look at Maggie as the protagonist. She wants to use the quilt as a quilt, thus preserving its place in the family tradition and heritage. And the story seems to support her desire to do that, so we can think of Maggie as the protagonist, as the person who fights for the story's values. On the other hand, Dee, Maggie's sister, works as the story's antagonist. She fights against the values of the story. She wants the quilt for its monetary value, not the heritage that it represents in her family, but rather what she can get for it for sale as an art piece. Thus, by talking about this conflict between protagonist and antagonist, we can give form to our ideas about the story's theme. Rather than just saying that the story is about the importance of family heritage, we can embody that idea in the struggle between Maggie and Dee, and thus show our readers more easily how we see the story and how Walker uses the relationship between protagonist and antagonist to express that theme in her work. Now, as you read more literature, you might keep looking for protagonists and antagonists. You'll probably notice that antagonists don't always appear as characters. Sometimes the protagonist will face obstacles from their environment. Indeed, sometimes protagonists even face those obstacles from within themselves. Whenever a story has a protagonist, that story must also have an antagonist of some kind. And the relationship between these two characters, or these two functions, can help us understand more deeply and with more, interest, how the story is expressing its meaning. Indeed, the meaning that that story wants to express. Paying attention to this conflict between protagonist and antagonist helps us as readers to look more deeply and to get more ideas from the stories we read. With that in mind, I hope that you will remember these terms, protagonist, antagonist, as you keep discussing literature. As always, Thank you for your time and attention.